This session is about how to write a great research paper. But in fact, we can just say how to write any research paper. So this session is really about how, equipping you to communicate your ideas in the best possible way. And this is from the view of being paper writers, reviewers, examiners of theses, being on grant committees, or being readers of your papers in general. So the way we'll do this is we'll have a 45-minute panel discussion where I'll ask all of these wise gentlemen their advice for how I should write a paper. Then we'll have a lunch break in which you can interrogate them even further. And then for the 45 minutes after lunch, a few of us will share a few more thoughts on how to write. So we're going to structure the panel discussion around 7 simple suggestions that this gentleman, Simon Peyton-Jones, he's still at Microsoft, shared once. If you follow the slides, there are links to videos and very interesting resources that he has. And he has these 7 suggestions for writing a paper, and we'll do the panel discussion around them. The first suggestion is that you should not wait to write until the very end. You should start writing, make writing a part of your process for doing research. The second one is that you should tell one story, have one key idea, tell one story with that idea, make sure that people understand your contributions. Think really hard about where you're going to put your related work. Think about your readers instead of making yourself sound very clever. Listen to your readers and gather feedback from them. And lastly, there's a bonus number 8 that we'll share a bit later, which are a few of Neil's thoughts from a discussion yesterday. So don't wait to write. So we have this idea of starting with a research idea. Then you do research for months on end, and then finally you get to a week before an ICML deadline and you write your paper. Another approach is to maybe start with your idea, and then write your paper, and then do your research to fill in the details of your paper. It forces you to be clear, focused, to crystallize all your thoughts. You can share your ideas around. So the question I want to ask the panel is, can you tell us, as students and as people who are keen to write papers, what your research workflow is? When do you write a paper? How do you start? Do you do it at the beginning? Do you wait until you have your first results?
I guess my instinct is to start writing early. Okay, so let's talk about writing theses for a moment. I know that's not the question, but I guess some people are writing theses. Like, the consistent thing when supervising PhD students is start your write-up as soon as possible, and they're like, no, I just want to get more results. And the reason you keep telling them to do that is because when you're doing the write-up, you suddenly find you're missing part of the story, and you need to do a little more experiments. So people sort of say, oh, I'll just then spend 6 months writing up at the end. But actually, you only learn what your narrative is missing once you start to create your narrative. And by the same token, that's really important for PhD theses, to start writing something down as soon as possible. By the same token, I apply the same thing to trying to write a paper, that the quicker you start getting your narrative down, the quicker you realize where the holes are and what the sort of interesting experiments you might want to do to fill those holes and tell a better story is. That's my personal, I don't know, Marco, what do you think?
Yeah, I completely second that. I would also say that it also helps to write path very clearly, very early on, and trying to find the right notations. For me, it's one of the most important problems that young students face, and I still face them, of course. It's like try to find the right way to write things in an abstract way in clear mathematical notation. So it also helps to start very early.
So I can give a quote which is attributed to Jeff Hinton, though I haven't heard him say it, which is, don't get it right, just get it written. I like that quote. Don't get it right, just get it written. One thing as well, which is helpful in the process of writing a paper, is to present versions of that early and often at talks. Like, give a talk to your group, give a talk to other groups, and, sarcastic audience questions can be terribly helpful because they concentrate the mind. It's like, oh yeah, you're right. This isn't actually very interesting. And then you think a bit harder about what you're doing and why. So this is another thing that's helpful.
Can I do the bonus number 8 just on the back of that?
Yes.
Because
Yes.
that was what. So the thing I don't like about Simon's things is they make out, and that's sort of just trying to follow on Arthur's point, they make out the paper exists in isolation and it's the only product of research. It doesn't. And exactly as Arthur says, the more you talk about the work, the more you'll refine your way of explaining and what the essence of your idea is. And the more you'll prepare the wider audience to receive the paper as reviewers, because often people will misinterpret what you're trying to do. Everyone thinks what you're trying to do is what they're trying to do or something else like that. And the earlier you get those conversations out in workshops and in formal areas, the better chance you have of getting your paper properly, better written and more likely to be accepted.
So one of the things I find pretty useful is quite early on to sit and get like the outline or the argument of the paper down. You don't have to write the whole thing together. In fact, I often find it quite difficult to just start writing. You know, there's a blank LaTeX document in front of you, and you like write your first sentence and say, no, that's crap, and delete it and try again. And actually, what I try and do is decouple what you want to say from how you want to say it. The important thing is to get the argument and the flow of your argument right, because then you can say, okay, I'm trying to make this claim, I'm going to support it in this way, or maybe I don't have enough evidence to support this, so I need to run another experiment. And to me, that's the important thing to get right quite early on. That also gives you your kind of short 1 or 2 page outline of an argument that you can share with people and discuss quite early on. And as a supervisor, I get my students to do that as well, because then I've got less reading to do on the first couple iterations, and that's pretty handy as well.
I was just going to reiterate 2 of the points. I was going to say exactly what Ben just said, that in the beginning, I like to, or we like to walk through the points that we're going to make, and then it ends up being kind of like a JPEG. You sort of zone in on those points, and then they become the paragraphs and the sentences of the paper. And also, the earlier you get started, the better, too, because it begins a dialogue with your supervisor. And I usually can't really meet about a project until there's a piece of LaTeX that I can read about it. And so the earlier that happens, even before running experiments and things like that, the better.
So I want to add one other thing. I've also found, like, if it takes a long time to start writing, you tend to waft all over the place. Like, you'll find something, you're working on something, you're like, hey, this is pretty cool, and you meander off in that direction. But as soon as you've got the gist of an argument in place, it's very easy to stay stuck to that argument. Otherwise, you can drift around for years and end up not writing a paper or a thesis or something that's really incoherent.
Yeah, 2 thoughts that just triggered from that. Another major difference, like for the whole of your life up until you start doing research in machine learning, you're being asked to make your thoughts sound more complex than they are when you're writing. And that is a disaster in machine learning. And you see it in other academic disciplines, I think. Machine learning is complex enough without trying to use convolved terms and waffly language to jazz it up. Everything should be written as simple as possible in as plain or English as possible. It will end up still really complex. But I think it was the first time in my life where suddenly it was okay to just try and keep it short and simple when I started writing research papers. Up until then, everyone's trying to encourage you always to make everything sound more flowery and more complicated, which is a disaster when you try it in machine learning.
And I'll just bounce back on another thought. Usually when you start writing up your paper, you start with the introduction, and then you really discover if you've done a good job doing the bibliographic survey. And sometimes I've seen papers that start and just stop immediately because the student realizes that actually the idea that he or she wanted to come up with was already taken. And maybe, having to write the introduction and just say a few lines about what has been done forces you to actually really dig a bit deeper than you thought was necessary, and then you find things. So it's also a good practice for that.
Okay. Cool. The second point of this 7 is to identify a key idea. Only one key idea. One sharp, reusable insight that you communicate to your reader. Maybe if you're starting research, you don't know exactly what that one message is, but definitely at the end, you should know what it is. And if you have more than one idea, if you have 3 ideas, write 3 papers on 3 ideas. So I want to ask the panel, how do you identify a key idea in practice? And then, as a writer, what bad habits do you try and avoid, like muddling two ideas in the same paper or obfuscating what you're really trying to communicate? How do you convince a reviewer of your one idea?
So this is, I guess, somewhat in answer to this question. Like, when you're starting a paper, there are two messages that I try to transmit. So one is, why is it new? And the other is, why should you care? And the first one is usually easy to say. But the second one is one that we, as humans, are inclined to avoid thinking about. So, you know, I have made a spectral-regularized version of a sparse-regularized version of a smoothed version of canonical correlation, and I've got 2% higher result on a benchmark set, right? So it's new. Why do you care? There's no reason to care. So one of the things, you know, in research and in writing papers is always to ask yourself, like, why is what I'm doing important and meaningful? And if you can't answer that question for yourself, probably you can't answer it for the reviewers either.
The so what factor. I mean, it's related to that, and it's a sort of easy trap to fall into. If you're working across disciplines, so I've done a lot of work in computational biology, I like to be problem-driven. Even if I'm doing work in pure machine learning, it's inspired by problems I've seen in domains. My early temptation was to write papers that were solving some problem in computational biology with some innovation in machine learning. That's a really bad idea because there's two things going on, and that confuses all the reviewers. Like, there's an innovative data set you're looking at, and you've got an innovative algorithmic treatment. They hate that. You really have to avoid doing that. And you know, all the very best people have done this as well. Tony O'Hagan, who wrote the first paper, well, I guess not the first paper, but a very important paper on Gaussian process models in about '78. He developed Gaussian processes for an active learning problem, we would call it. They'd call it experimental design. And his supervisor specifically told him to separate the active learning problem he'd solved into a separate paper from the one about Gaussian processes. And he refused, and he says it's a massive regret about that paper. If you read that paper today, it's all about this active learning problem, but we all cite it because of its material on Gaussian processes. So the best of us are always doing that because people are kind of keen to show all their good works that they've done. Look what I did at school. I mean, and it's just like, again, it's like theses. The best thesis is what you leave out that's important more often than what you put in.
I wanted to share something with you. My sister's she's like a world-class professional storyteller. And it's true, she's on YouTube and she's on the radio sometimes. She tells stories about her life. They make me uncomfortable, but people like them a lot. And, but once she and I were talking, and she was telling me about how, and she teaches people how to tell stories, and she was telling me the kind of framework that she uses to think about a story. And when she taught it to me, I thought, you know, that could really help in just having conversations about research ideas and understanding what a research idea is about. And it also sometimes, especially if it's like 5 minutes before the deadline, helps you write a quick introduction to your paper if you need to. And so I'll just share with you this, this little framework she has. So I think I remembered it correctly. It starts with the world as it was, then one day, raising the stakes, moment of truth, the world as it is now. And so the idea of the world as it was is the world before your paper was written. Then one day is your key insight. It's like, you know, you had this idea that maybe if I created landmark variables, I could do variational inference better in a Gaussian process or something like that. Raising the stakes is about understanding how, if you could do that, then what impact would it have on other things? What kinds of problems would you be able to solve? Moment of truth is kind of the quick description of what you needed to do to get it to work. And then the world as it is now is a summary of your results and, you know, what is possible now that you've developed that algorithm that involves these inducing points, these landmark points. So anyway, I find that to be a useful way to think about what is a paper about. And sometimes when a student or somebody I'm working with comes in and they have a paper idea, and a lot of times the work is to figure out what the heck is going on, like what is the paper about that they are at my whiteboard telling me about. Writing these little categories down and trying to fit it into that helps clarify and crystallize what it is happening, or if there's maybe multiple ideas. Anyway.
And actually, you see this when you're reviewing as well, that if sometimes this paper will come in and you start reading it and you're kind of wading through the introduction and the rest of it going, what the hell is this paper all about? And that's usually when someone's tried to pack way too many ideas into the thing, and you've got to try and tease out where the contributions lie. And conversely, if you do this, I mean, I've certainly done this as well, and then you get your reviews back, and the first paragraph of the review is always like the summary of the paper from the reviewer's point of view. And you look at this and like, no, that's not at all what I was doing. And usually that happens when you try to fit too much in, and then inevitably the reviewer is going to focus on exactly what you didn't mean for them to focus on. And like there was some core contribution that they completely missed because you wrote the wrong things and put the emphasis in the wrong place.
Okay, I want to touch on Benji's point. That's the one story that you want to tell, that the reviewer does not get confused. So Benji, how would you or Marco create one narrative?
Yeah, so this kind of also matches for the previous question, but it's also for this one. So I have another way to, a slightly different way to be able to create such a story, and I envision it more as in terms of zigzags. So it's like the first direction should be something that everybody agrees with. So let's say, I don't know, GANs are cool, or at least some people agree with in the community, a big enough share of the community agrees with. So GANs are cool, let's say, and then you zigzag saying that there's an obvious problem. Let's say, for instance, metric for success of GANs is obviously a big issue, and so that's a disaster. But there is this nice recent trend that proposes this and this and that, but it doesn't really work that well because and then this way you kind of bring your reader to your idea. For me, this is a strategy to bring the reader to understand roughly where the crux of your story is.
That sounds like the Breaking Bad approach to paper writing. Everything seems to be going well, and then and it's going well. How does it end?
Okay. Next one is to make sure that whoever reads your paper knows exactly and can enumerate what your core contributions are. So this is the idea of taking your contributions and nailing them to the mast, so that your reader can say, your core contributions of this paper are 1, 2, and 3 because of A, B, and C. So I have a challenge for our panel. I started writing a paper yesterday, and this is my opening paragraph. My paper starts saying, regularization has recently gained a lot of attention. Neural networks often overfit. It is very important that they don't overfit, and I cite my first two papers. Many researchers have studied overfitting. It is really a very important topic. As a reviewer, how would you react, and how would you fix a sales pitch like this to communicate one message, and where are the contributions and the reasoning not clear?
I would just bounce back exactly what I was saying.
Yeah.
Basically start with something that's obvious and that everybody agrees, and then maybe present the problem, and then do a succession of solutions, problems, and in the end, hopefully there is still a problem left that you can bring a solution to.
I would rewrite it with, a Gaussian process is a non-parametric prior over function.
So perhaps one crime that all of us are guilty of is starting with like, blah, blah, blah is a very important field. This is such an annoying starting sentence. I use it, you shouldn't, I shouldn't, don't. The other thing is, you are, I think, insufficiently specific. Like, overfitting is bad, we shouldn't overfit, fine. But if that generic a statement is how you're starting your paper, then you haven't really told me what you're doing, because overfitting is bad could have been said 100 years ago. and we shouldn't overfit likewise. So like, be more concrete.
And the flow here is also kind of strange because you're talking about regularization and then neural networks and overfitting, and it's not in a kind of logical continuous flow that starts with one idea. You might start with talking about a specific problem in neural networks and why this is a problem, and then move on to in the zigzag kind of idea how you want to start regularizing and then what you're going to do about that. But statements like the last two are also pretty vacuous. They don't say anything. You're kind of wasting your characters where you should be putting more useful things.
This is a cool exercise. I mean, I don't see what the contribution is. That's one issue. Another, when my advisor gave me this advice about writing, which was, you use the word important here a couple times, and then a lot. There's adjectives in there. And my advisor gave me the advice that whenever you use an adjective, to look at that adjective and ask if it's justified. And if it's justified, then add a sentence that justifies it afterwards, and then remove the adjective. If it's not justified, remove the adjective. Okay. And this leads to adjective-free papers.
I have just a brief thing. According to Ben Recht, neural networks don't overfit, so this whole thing is moot.
So I think that the trick when you're wanting to do this is to give an example. So to sort of say how the problem's arising, like yesterday 15 people died because the neural network overfitted. This is a serious, or whatever we're going to get there. And then everyone knows it's a problem. Here it's sort of you're starting with a generic thing. So I guess I'm not sure of a good example of that. But as soon as someone's come out with it, okay, so the adversarial network work. Like when they first showed that a neural network would classify these pigs as airplanes or whatever else, I just thought, duh, that's so obvious. Personally, sorry, that was me. But what I didn't really quite appreciate, right, is just that example has triggered so much research as the motivating example, and we've seen it in a number of talks, like around, I think, Bernard used it. I mean, it pops up everywhere because everyone says, yeah, look at that, that's a problem. And therefore, it makes it a great starting point. And I kind of think that the amount of work on those adversarial examples is almost driven by the beauty of that example as something that captures the imagination, more than whether that's reflecting a fundamental problem that we might have, because adversarial attacks are probably not going to be of that nature. But it's just such a beautiful example that everyone sort of wants to start with it, I feel. I mean, other people might disagree.
Okay. In line with my not so great introduction about stating an important problem, I want to ask the panel what they think refutable contributions are, as opposed to just someone presenting a neural network model. How would you look at a contribution in someone's paper and someone says, oh, I've just designed a new neural network with 4 layers instead of 3, and this is my contribution, as opposed to something that can be refutably tested?
So this is something I think the field's not doing a great job of at the moment. Well, that's a fairly broad statement, but I think there's a conflation of these engineering problems and science problems. And so often you'll have just that. Someone will say, hey, look, I built a model that can do X, which isn't really the scientific question that we typically want to look at in a paper, which would say, I've got some hypothesis, and can I run some experiments and then see if this actually holds up under different conditions, or how it generalizes, or something like that. And so you'll tend to find in the same areas that both of these kind of papers come up, and I think that really complicates things.
Okay.
Could we do a bit more on the...
Yes, one more.
I will say just briefly, like my experience as an area chair in conferences is that a lot of the most sort of frustrating rejects for the authors are papers where they sort of have done something and it's been hard work and they wrote a really nice paper on a topic that no one really cares about. And, and then the reviewers say, well, yeah, but you've got a slightly better result on these toy benchmarks. Is it really worth all of the song and dance that you've just performed? So, but the trouble is, that problem should have been caught much, much earlier in the process. So, this is something I think you should all be aware of. Like, if you can't really justify why it is that you're doing what you're doing, then you're probably on the wrong track.
So just the nailing the contributions to master, it was a slightly different point. I think in PhD theses, sometimes students make the mistake of not signposting when it's their work and when it's other people's work, because they sort of have this, a classic mistake that younger writers tend to make is they just assume that everyone else knows everything that they know. By the time you get to the end of your thesis, you're the world expert on the thing you've done. And when your thesis examiner is reading it, they have no clue about all this stuff that you've written about. And a big error when writing theses is to assume that they know that which bits are novel and which bits aren't, because they just don't. So, I mean, it's true to a lesser extent in papers, but it's particularly true in theses. You have to signpost the point at which your the stuff you're talking about, the background, finishes, and the point at which your work starts. It makes it much, much easier for an examiner.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think both in papers and in theses, it's really useful if you explicitly state the contributions in this paper or in this thesis are as follows. It really gets the reviewer, the examiner, to pay attention to the right parts of this. And actually somewhere else where this happens a lot is in giving talks. So you'll often have, particularly with new students, they'll give their first talk and they'll kind of transition seamlessly from the background work into the work that they actually did. And you're sitting there at some point going, wait, no, was this from the previous guys you were talking about, or was this your own contribution?
It's definitely important to be clear about what your contribution is in the paper. Readers, though, get turned off by slipping into bragging about your contributions. It's something I think, to pay attention to in writing. If you overstate or repeatedly state how great your contribution is, it can turn a reader off to trying to understand what it is you did.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And often a good way of doing it is, if you're talking about, in a paper, you're talking about related work that inspired you, be clear about what inspired you about that work, be positive about why that work was really interesting, and then be clear why you felt that it needed to be expanded upon in a new and interesting way. You probably end up getting your paper sent to the authors of that previous work. And if you write it in the right way, they'll be excited that you enjoyed their work and have chosen to build upon it. If you write it in the wrong way, they'll be really pissed off that you're minimizing their innovation and everything else.
Yeah, I like to say that assume that the person you're being most disparaging towards is the one who's actually going to review the paper. So if you're going to make those claims, make sure you're willing to stand by them and you're not just saying it just because you want to make your work look better.
So related to all of this, when you're responding to reviewers, don't double down on the mistakes you made the first time round. So if you started arrogant and then you go twice as arrogant in your response because the reviewers don't appreciate how brilliant you are, probably it's not going to help. So, be collegial, lead the reviewers on a journey to understand, sure, we thought the same thing, and but actually there's this, and make it a narrative, and then people are probably going to go with you rather than digging in.
Okay. And speaking about related work, and your reviewers have also written papers that you possibly cite, how do you treat related work? And as a writer, where should I put my related work? Some people say that you should put related work at the end of your paper so that it doesn't get between you and the idea. Other disciplines prefer related work just at the end of the introduction. To the panel, what should I do as a writer?
We've been doing something new with this lately, or some of us have in my group, which is because we had this problem. Sometimes related work comes right after the introduction, but it can be disorienting because, some of that related work is related because of the particular type of path gradient that you used in the third technical section of your paper. But when you mention it on page 2, the reader doesn't know what you're talking about, and so you're kind of asking him or her to believe you that this paper is related because of a bunch of jargon that you're going to define later, and it doesn't work, right? It makes everyone sad. And so, but there is some related work that should happen right after the introduction, which is anything that someone can understand its relationship to what you did relative to what they just read in the introduction. And so that's often situating kind of where your contribution sits in the bigger landscape of research. And so we like to put that related work there. So whatever I wrote in the introduction, say the world as it is and all that stuff, the work related to the world as it is goes in that related work. And then after we've done our technical section where we derive new types of path gradients, etc., then we started putting a new section in called connections. And that section then talks about the details, or you can intersperse those details within the technical section. But I think separating out, not all related work is the same, separating them out into those two different types can help make your paper more coherent.
So I think there's no, I think that's a really interesting answer, and there's no real right answer to this. And it depends, and that's something I wanted to emphasize. You've got to write to your audience and the traditions of the field. If you read a CVPR paper, like the first page is like Genesis or something, Cain begat Abel, Abel begat so-and-so, and then in the beginning there was light, and then computer vision started. You know, and if you don't cover every sort of piece of work that comes up to yours, they get really pissed off. If you read a NeurIPS paper, it always starts with this sort of really punchy, this is the most important problem in the world, and I've solved it. And then it sort of starts introducing other things later on. I kind of hate sections that just say related work. I think that and this is all personal. You have to read what people are doing in the area. My personal preference is you intersperse your inspirations within the main text. And if one of them's causing a branch, if you think something's cool but you didn't follow it, use footnotes to sort of just briefly mention that as a side thing. And that's my preferred thing. But there's this big thing like that you write your literature review first in your thesis. And that leads to a really bad habit of these sort of literature reviews and then a failure to reference anything in the next sort of section. So it just totally depends. To me, there's no right way. There's ways I personally prefer, but then you have to see what the papers in the area you're submitting to do, because there will be expectations from the community you're submitting to. And if you don't fulfill those expectations, they're going to reject you, whether it was a nice style or not.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I also, I mean, my preference is to go towards David's model, where you kind of split related work into two. The obvious one, that's more like laying ground for your work, and then the more detailed ones. I would add to that maybe if there's one paper that's really close to what you just did, don't wait to page number 6 to quote it, because usually that's a very bad thing. So even if it's a very technical contribution and you're just adding something that's extremely technical to that previous contribution, don't wait and say at some point in introduction, by the way, what we did is related to what blah, 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 blah did, and we will explain later in the paper why. And this way you're covered.
No, I agree basically with what Marco and David were saying, that, you know, I have the references split into, in the introduction, regardless of, you know, all other matters, I have all of my sources, like close and near, and then as particular technical references become relevant within the document, I then cite those individual papers with the explanations, like once you have the vocabulary to understand them. But as Marco's saying, having everything up front is super important, because, like, you know, reviewer 2 is going to read your paper and they're going to look for their citation and they're not going to see it in the introduction. That's the end of your paper. So make sure that's there.
They read the citations directly.
Perhaps.
Yeah, I completely agree with what everyone said. But I think the most important thing is, as you're going through this, your reader should understand why you've written what you've written and how it fits in. If you've got the sentence that'll only make sense 3 sections later, then there's no point having it up earlier.
Okay, our next point, number 6, is how to put your readers first. This touches on something that Neil mentioned earlier, is that in most writing you want to try and sound as intelligent as possible. And suddenly in our discipline you want to actually explain things in really the simplest possible terms. So for the panel, what has helped you to explain things simply to your readers, and how do you make your readers your like best friends, exactly.
I started last time. I have something quick to say about this. It's not quick. I read this book last year that shaped for me a lot of how I think about this lately, which is called Clear and Simple as the Truth. It's an amazing book. I learned about it from another book about writing, Steve Pinker's book about writing. He had a chapter about this book, and I read that chapter and I thought, I want to read that original book, and I got the book, and it's amazing. And I bring it up now because in that book, which I recommend you read, Clear and Simple as the Truth it's called, they talk about this way of writing. It's basically a device to help you write, and it's to imagine that you are in a conversation with the reader. It's one reader, it's not many readers. It's also not a reviewer, it's a reader. And that you are basically describing your idea. So you really imagine that, like, you know, you and Neil are walking down the street and you're telling your idea to Neil, and you write it as though you're telling your idea to Neil. That's one of the devices that they recommend. And it's helped me a lot in thinking about when I'm explaining something, I pause and I think, all right, Neil and I are on vacation and we are, you know, I'm going to tell him about this idea. It's not always Neil, but it's usually Neil. The second thing, and this is where Neil is not going to be relevant, is to assume that your reader is interested in what you have to say. And that helps. Yeah, but this actually really helps because, you know, we're writing papers, we're stressed, we want the paper to get into CVPR or AI Stats or wherever, and we're thinking about the next thing that's going to happen with this paper, which is that we're going to get those review reports back that are critical, and so we try to kind of write defensively for the reviewers. We don't want the reviewers to hate our paper, and so if we say something that's maybe a little that they could disagree with, we start immediately defending it. And this book, Clear and Simple as the Truth, says, assume your reader is interested in what you have to say. And that is a liberating idea. You sit down with your paper and you're writing your paper and you want to explain your idea, and you suddenly don't have to continuously justify the different choices you're making because you assume that Neil is interested. And so you justify it the way you would justify it to someone who's already interested. He's not taking it for granted, but he's interested. He's not an adversary. So those two ideas for thinking about readers have helped me lately.
Actually, I can add another essay to that mix, and you'll have to forgive me for the forbidding title, but there's an Orwell essay, Politics in the English Language. It starts a little bit of an uphill slog, so it's also short, so bear with it. And in this essay, he gives terrific examples of, I think, a combination of errors of thought and errors of expressing thought, which are enormously helpful. So by the time you've reached the end of that essay, I think, you know, this will benefit your writing enormously, it'll benefit your thinking, and it will also, you know, I guess, help you to express yourself more clearly.
I think those are nice. I probably don't have, but one thing that I think I found helpful for myself was to, again, a bit related to what I said before, the game has sort of changed in terms of your writing. One thing I've noticed is non-native English speakers often learn how to do technical English writing quicker and better than English speakers, because native English speakers keep assuming it's something that they know how to do, like in terms, because they've been writing all their lives. But because the amazing thing we're in is we've got stuff in our heads that we want other people to know, and we're using writing as a communication mechanism to explain it. Up until then, you didn't have anything new in your heads that anyone else cared about. So you were kind of writing for the sake of writing. And that's a total game changer. And a common error among native English speakers is to assume it's like the classical writing, rather than trying to learn from scratch how you do that. And because, of course, non-native English speakers are trying to learn just how to produce papers, they tend to go directly for the goal and often arrive at it better than a native English speaker.
So I think I'm the only non-native English speaker here, so I completely agree with that. I remember reading, I mean, not with that part, the fact that we get it nailed better, but the fact that there are some resources that are very useful, and I remember a book that really helped me. It was called Scientific Writing for Non-Native English Speakers.
All these titles have nothing to do with it. They're straight for the goal.
Exactly. And it laid out very clearly, well, this idea first that you just gave, which is that scientific English is not the same as English, and really insisting on many aspects such as, well, scientific writing is really not about writing. When you write things, you like to keep some suspense, some hidden facts that you maybe show right up in the end of the book. And scientific writing is the complete opposite of that. You start with the end, basically, somewhere. You explain clearly what you've just contributed, and it has a lot of very nice advice. So I would really recommend it.
Okay, I want to ask what you do with your readers that have already read your papers. So, for instance, these could be reviewers that give you feedback, or maybe in your lab you might have your grad students send you a paper a month before the submission deadline, and you give them feedback. So actually in DeepMind we have a policy that all our papers have to be done a week before the submission deadline, or more. And that gives people time to do a last internal review process. And that's actually helped a lot, to not do this frantic spike at midnight just before the submission window closes. And then who would read your drafts? And at what time would people read your drafts for your papers? And who else would you ask for feedback? And when would you do that?
I think one thing just particularly about reviewers is when I get that feedback, I try and, annoyed as I might be by them, try and assume that generously they were trying to do their best there, and that anything they misunderstood was my fault in the way that I wrote it. I wasn't clear enough on certain things. So try and look at what they've written and figure out at what point did they lose the argument I was trying to present to them, and what could I have rewritten or presented slightly differently or more concisely that wouldn't have had that happen.
My feeling is maybe we might even do an extra session on rebuttals, because rebuttals are a almost different skill set, it feels to me, than writing a paper. So I think the art of the rebuttal is to clearly outline what the reviewer got wrong, very politely and in a very, I would say, positive way, but never lose ground. So never, if you believe that a reviewer has misunderstood something that you have written, you think have written quite clearly, then just state this very clearly again and again. And there's lots of other advice that can come up with, but rebuttals are extremely important, it seems to me. Even more now than in the past. I mean, like, I remember that 5, 6, 7 years ago, NIPS papers, well, people thought that rebuttals didn't really make a big change, but in my recent experience, it's increasingly the case.
Actually, I wrote a blog post about rebuttals a while ago. I think the number one thing was to read it once when you get the reviews and then wait 24 hours before you respond. But actually, the idea of conceding ground, I think it relates to some of the things we were talking about before in terms of understanding what your narrative is. The mistake, or very often, which is a mistake for generals in war as well, is to try and keep all ground. You have to understand what your main thrust is and ensure that you focus on that. Arthur and I were discussing this last night. I have a slightly different opinion to Arthur. I don't think your reviewers are your readers. I think that they provide a totally different role. I think that it's kind of a broken system, and that they very often are adversarial when it's set up like that. And a paper that reviewers don't like can be really well written towards readers. So a paper that's a simple idea, very well explained, that you can understand within the first paragraph, that'll be rejected from Eurips, no problem. But those are the most important. I mean, because if you can change someone's mind about something in 2 paragraphs, that's like the most important paper you could ever write. But somehow I feel Arthur disagrees. A lot of reviewers don't like that. So let's try and focus on the positive, and in terms of the readers. One trick you can use is that you become a different person over time. So if you get a draft of your paper down early, then when it comes to the submission deadline, rereading what you wrote, you read it, I feel, as a different person. And you're an excellent critic for yourself. You're not shy about upsetting yourself. And that's a sort of another sort of challenge about, you know, reading other people's drafts. How do you sort of provide feedback in a constructive way as well? So think about that when you're doing that as well.
So not talking directly to Neil's point, but eventually indirectly. So one thing I want to reiterate is that giving talks early and often, like hopefully you've sort of debugged issues of clarity and presentation before the rebuttal phase. Because if you're doing it in the rebuttal phase, then probably you're already touch and go, and yeah, it's like send to the next conference, it's already over. I guess another point which did come up earlier, which I'll reiterate, is that like in the rebuttal phase, you need to sort of like, whatever the tone that the reviewers take, you need to transform that tone into a collegial tone. That like if you speak in such a way that you assume good intentions in your reviewers, it's more likely that they will respond to that with good intentions. So, you know, be constructive, be sympathetic. If you're defensive, if you're angry, if you're arrogant, forget it, you're gone, paper's dead. So, you know, there is a chance, like for AI stats this year, all of my reviewers for one of my papers increased their scores. And they were quite hostile at first. And I don't think that's because the paper improved in the paragraph that I had to explain myself. But being constructive and helpful and collegial will help, I think, tremendously.
So that's a good point, actually. Just as you said that, we had an ICLR paper where we went from, I think, borderline to talk in the rebuttal phase. So people do respond. But then I was just thinking, because of open review, you can go and read that. You can read what the reviewers said, what our rebuttal was, and how the reviewers changed their mind. And you can read all of those. So in the old days, before you'd submitted a paper, you'd never had a chance to see reviews and rebuttals. So I would spend, you know, I hadn't thought that until you mentioned that, but it must be a great resource. I haven't looked at it myself, but to see what the sort of conversations are and how people are responding.
Just, and NeurIPS now allows you to send a full page. And this year, this is just personal experience as well. As area chair, I've noticed that papers that took the time, authors that took the time to maybe provide a little more, maybe graphs, a few more results, maybe explanations that were more visual in their one-page rebuttal, had a very, very high chance of getting the score up. So if you submit to NeurIPS next June or May, take advantage of this then in July. Please build a very nice, good-looking rebuttal.
Yeah, I'll say last thing about being a reviewer. The worst thing of being a reviewer is if you reject a paper for one conference and you've spent a number of hours writing reviewer feedback to the authors, suggesting changes, and then the same paper appears on your desk for the next conference, reformatted without a single full stop moved. The nicest thing a reviewer can get is a paper that's a resubmission where many of their comments have been seriously considered and addressed. Remember that, because I've seen it more than once where the same paper lands on my desk, and it's incredibly annoying if you work very hard as a reviewer or as a reader and the authors ignore you. Okay, I want to spend the last minute to wrap up and ask the panel to tell us something about code and maybe writing for a particular audience.
I just want to say something that's right before we move on. Reviewing is anonymous, but most of us know who is doing what, especially when you become area chair. So be extremely careful, because it's maybe one of the easiest way to get spotted as a person that's not doing his or her job right. So to me, it became a revelation in recent years that your reputation is actually almost built as much as how you behave when you write papers and as when you review them.
Okay, any last words about writing code as part of the writing process?
So I guess I brought this up because when I saw Simon's things, I thought, yeah, all that's great, and that's the traditional way we think of research. I'm very into the fact that papers, when they first were produced, were just a method of communicating ideas. They weren't ways that you were scoring for your faculty job or deciding who to employ or anything else. And I think that we really need to keep that in sight. I mean, I think that the code that people are producing now, good, robust code that reproduces someone's work, I'm not even just the particular experiments in a paper, but that someone else can build on, is a lot more valuable than most papers. And I think we're just seeing a difference in the way research is done now, in terms of we can share ideas through code as well as papers. We can share it through workshops, through discussions. The community, it's not all about papers. A paper is a sort of traditional thing that we use. And I think it's even shocking that it's still in PDF, right? Because PDF is for printing out and putting it on a horse's back and riding it across, and I really would like us to get into... What's that? Where does the horse go? Because if you go back, so read, there's this thing called monolithic correspondence, right? You can find it in Google Books. In 1801, Gauss publishes in there where Ceres is. There were no railways. These were leather-bound volumes that a guy called, a Hungarian astronomer was pulling together from letters he was receiving across the world. That's what a journal was for, not for you to get tenure or anything else. It was for scientists to share their ideas so that openly, such that scientific progress could be made as rapidly as possible. When you lose sight of that, then you lose sight of what this community has been able to achieve so far by trying to follow that spirit to a large extent. And that is the most important thing, I feel, in the end.
Yeah. So in a purely selfish sense, one benefit of releasing code is that more people are going to use your method and cite you. Positive. Another thing which you should also consider is if you're too embarrassed for your code to be released to the world, then are you sure that the research that you're doing is in fact good? And so I basically require all my students to release their code for their papers, because if they're too embarrassed to do that, then maybe they shouldn't be publishing the paper.
On a related note, I was in a discussion at Neurops with a few people from different tech companies in the US and the UK, and they were saying one of the biggest things across the board that they use now for deciding to hire in research jobs isn't so much your publication record, but the kinds of projects you've got and how you've released them on GitLab or GitHub or something like that.
Last words from David.
It says lunch break.
No, let's have some last words from you. I know you have some notes.
I didn't have much to add beyond what people said about code. Yeah, my last remark would just be I would reiterate what Neil said, to focus on thinking about papers as you're trying to communicate something to a reader. And all the scaffolding around conferences and reviews and rebuttals and citations and things like that, of course we're all going to worry about that stuff, but when you're writing, try not to worry about it. One, you'll enjoy the writing process better. It's a creative process and it's fun. And two, I think the papers will end up clearer and better. And then all the rest of that stuff might fall into place.
Thank you very much. Everyone, let's just applaud our wonderful panel.